Okay, can you hear me, everybody? Great. Hello from Australia. It's that's why I've got my lights on in the background and it looks a bit gloomy. It's about 10 o'clock at night here, so I'm guessing most of you are at the other end of the day, at the other end of the world. But it's very nice to see you all. Let me just see now, Katerina, I just checked this. Actually, I can't remember. Did I do share window or did I do share screen? I think I did share screen. Let's just see. Okay, Katerina, can you tell me if you see my slide?
I can see your slides.
And does it change?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. All right. If it gets stuck, just give me a shout because I can't see you now. So I also can't see if everybody's gone to sleep. So I'll just keep pressing on until you tell me to stop. And I'll go for about 40 minutes or so, and then we've got time for 20 minutes of questions. So hello, everybody. It's really lovely to be talking with you. You can probably tell I'm British by my voice, which I am. Although I'm based in Melbourne now, I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne, and I'm the director of Melbourne School of Design. But I'm also a visiting prof at UCL, where I work with Mariana Mazzucato, who I'm sure many of you will know her or her work at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And I'm going to talk a lot about public purpose, I guess, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, and try and connect that to the sort of policy making for everyday life, if you like. And it's going to come up with innovation quite a lot, as it says here, because I've worked often in those circles, innovation policy, innovation practice. But please be ensured that it's kind of about dragging innovation down to the ground, as in putting it into practice in policy and practice generally, or service delivery even. I'm going to talk a lot about Finland and Sweden. I might get to Australia if I've got time. We'll see. The UK will come up and there'll be time at the end for Q&A. So maybe hold your questions if possible, and I'll but remember them and we'll get to them. So just by way of background briefly, my background is as a designer on these kinds of things, and kind of still is really, but big city projects, urban development projects all over the world, whether it's the Google campus in the top left or big chunk of Sydney or Amsterdam there, but you also see Sheffield City Centre in there. I grew up in Sheffield, that's where I'm from. State Library of Queensland. I worked at the BBC for many years in the early 2000s as the head of interactive technology and design, basically helping get the BBC onto the internet, and was the design lead for iPlayer for a while before it launched. So that's my background really, a strong amount of publicness, because dealing with cities often involves publicness, but also in the public sector for things like the BBC. But a lot of those projects have also been from the private sector perspective. And in the bottom right there, just a little thing is a cell phone that I worked on a couple of years ago, which is a cell phone, not a smartphone, so it just does data, and so it's no data rather, which is calls and texts. So it's about how do you get your attention back actually while you're out and about. So I'll talk more about a kind of a critical approach to technology throughout this as well. The last role before going to Melbourne was at Vinnova in the Swedish government, which is the Swedish government's innovation agency. So in the national government there, where I was director of strategic design. And the background here is what I would call strategic design, or what a whole bunch of us call it now, I suppose. And that, in a sense, comes as much from anywhere as these kinds of realizations in this quote from Madeleine Albright, where she says, we're taking 21st century challenges, evaluating the 20th century ideas, arguably even 19th century ideas, I'd say, and sometimes the tools are 19th, perhaps 18th century. So things like national governments, of course, emerge in the 18th, 19th century quite often, not that much before that. In some places, yes, but pretty incoherent actually. And so those major institutions are relatively recent things over the last couple of hundred years, perhaps. But now we're tackling 21st century challenges like climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, social justice, aging population slowdown, all of these things we've never really had to deal with before, arguably. And we've found ourselves in a bit of a bind, as in the tools that created climate change are unlikely to just reverse them or be able to fix that. It's pretty hard to get those tools to do something other than what they were intended to do, it turns out. So that's where we are. And immediately you start thinking, well, we can't then wring new conditions out of the same engine in the same way. So we need to think about the change of conditions itself. It's not just about designing something like a building or a policy, but actually the conditions that produce those things, the culture of design or policy making, the structure of things, the process behind things. Those are what happens at the end of the day. I remember the quote from Peter Drucker, I think, culture eats a strategy for breakfast. So no matter what your strategy says, the culture is really what happens. We really need to be paying attention to that. So there's a lot of things underneath that as well. I love this quote from the British architect Cedric Price, who said in the mid-60s, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And he was really thinking about how the technology of the car was being prioritized in cities all over the world, including the UK, of course, and tearing cities apart, really. And perhaps if we'd sat down and thought, well, what is London about? What's Manchester for? How does Bristol move around? Then talked about technology, it might have been a better approach. But instead, we have a tendency to jump on the technology, the solution. And that kind of solutionism is deeply problematic. For instance, Uber and Lyft, ride sharing generally, those of you who are old enough to remember when they came in about 10 years ago, or maybe even less, the promise was that they would reduce traffic because it's sharing cars, right? So that therefore means by definition, fewer cars. Of course, those systems do the exact opposite, because the reason Uber and Lyft works very well for an individual is because it incentivizes a driver to be out on the streets looking for individuals. So it increases traffic by 40, 50% or so in cities like San Francisco, which already had a traffic problem. And of course, that leads to an increase in actual deaths. And never mind carbon emissions. So all of those things are coming out of a technology being introduced without thinking carefully, again, back to Cedric's point, what was the question here? So we're still doing this 40, 50 years after he voiced that concern. And the way that we design these things, of course, is important because it speaks to what we think of as ourselves as a society. What are we about? This quote from Kieran Long, ex of the V&A, now ArcDes in Stockholm, says that design's task gives form to societal ideas. So justice, a societal idea, takes its form in things like a courthouse or a justice system. So the way we design those things speaks to what we think of justice, or what we think of society in the context of justice. And that could be a hot dog kiosk, as he says here, or a cemetery. It displays these weaknesses or prejudices, or the opposite, our aspirations, as in with this beautiful town hall by Anna Jacobsen in the background there in Aarhus. So strategic design is about actually stepping back a little bit and asking about core questions, core principles. What are the core principles of contemporary design practice? And how do we point them at broader ethical concerns or societal and environmental outcomes? How do we address the conditions through which things are produced? Not just a library, but the conditions that produce a library, not just a public transport system, but the conditions that produce it, not just taxation, but understand what are the conditions that produce our thoughts on what taxation is? What does it mean? How does it articulate itself? That's a kind of design too. And it means that we have a huge array of different types of design that can be brought to bear here. They sort of pan out across this diagram, which I'm still rethinking all the time. I kind of daren't publish it because I know how wrong it is. But at the same time, there's something kind of right about it in that it sort of tries to stack up these different design capabilities across the different scales here, if you like. So Uber or Lyft, coming back to my example, is something at the thing scale and the services scale, really. It's an app in your pocket, and of course there's a service behind it. And so the design disciplines there are things like interaction design and service design, but where it goes awry is that they are not thinking through the impact of Uber or Lyft at the scale of the city. And a city is, of course, where these things actually multiply or take manifold effects. And that's where you have usually things like urban planning, but of course urban planning doesn't really think about the thing end of stuff enough, as we know. It doesn't really understand Uber in the detailed sense, usually. There are honorable exceptions to all of this stuff, of course. So you see down the bottom there, strategic design is really trying to orchestrate those things. It's not saying it does all of those things, by the way. It's just saying that we have to have a conversation up and down those scales. We can't really hold the interaction designer at Uber responsible for it wrecking cities. But I mean, maybe we should. I mean, we probably should engage in a discussion about whether they ought to have the responsibility. An architect certainly is trained to have an ethical responsibility for the city, even though they tend to make buildings. Interaction designers don't really have that training in them quite as much, but now that they're beginning to impact on physical things, then they do, or they should do. Strategic design, either way, has to kind of frame these conversations, move around that diagram. What's really important here is that an understanding that design isn't really about problem solving, it's about question asking, really, or cultural imagination, as I put it here. It's about discovering and inventing ideas and making them into things. Again, this relationship between a society idea and giving it form or giving it some kind of thingness, I guess. Engineers are much better at solving problems, for instance, as I point out here, dentists and plumbers. You know, a plumber is what you call when you have a leak in your bathtub or under your kitchen sink. You know, a designer is useless at that point, because the designer is usually asking, what is water anyway? Or why do we have plumbing? You know, that you don't want to ask those questions when you've got water pouring out of the sink. That's when you call the plumber. The designer's role is to really stand back to some extent and understand those complex processes and systems and flows and buildings and so on, and understand how they might be reorganized to address systemic challenges. So let me give you some examples now. So 10 years ago, I worked at Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, which is a little bit like a kind of Finnish Nesta, but perhaps a little bit more engaged and understood within society more directly, perhaps, and perhaps a bigger player, albeit within a smaller country. And we did a huge amount of work there. The team and I, Brian Boyer, Justin Cook, Marco Steinberg, and myself, and a few of our other colleagues at Sitra, around strategic design and building networks around it, doing lots of projects, all written up in these books, which are on screen now. And I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, so you don't have to frantically screen grab. But that describes a lot of what we were doing back then, kind of forging this practice to some degree. And some examples. We were working on a new headquarters for Sitra, but we wanted to do that in a way that was also demonstrating how to make a new neighborhood block within Finland. We knew the built environment industry needed some innovation, just as it does in the UK. The sector is usually the absolute laggard when it comes to innovation generally, and certainly in terms of CO2. So we needed to kind of lift that. So we used our own need to make an HQ in order to create a city block. Here's a render of it. We wanted to make that city block in cross-laminate timber, as in fully in wood, because wood is carbon positive, essentially, or at least carbon negative. Carbon flat. It sort of stores the carbon, sequesters it in the building. Cement and steel are amongst the worst things you can put on the ground in terms of carbon. So we wanted to demonstrate another way of doing this. And it's handy that Finland is also largely made of wood. And there's an amazing wood industry there, but it wasn't being used in construction at all. It really optimized around steel and concrete. So when we did the designs, though, we realized that the building code for the city, and in fact, most of southern Finland, said you can't build a wooden building over a few stories because it just hadn't been updated. And in the old days, of course, wooden buildings burnt. These buildings with engineered timber do not burn. They char at best. They're actually safer than concrete and steel in many respects. The UK building code needs to be updated here, by the way. Anyway, so the Finnish building code also needed updating, but this was 10 years ago. And so our lawyers worked with the city of Helsinki's lawyers, or the building code of Finland's lawyers, rather, to change the building code so that this building could be made, but equally every other building could be made from wood from now on. So you see the building that we worked on down the bottom there with the yellow stripes. But the buildings all around it are also made of timber, actually. And that isn't anything to do with us, but it's because we changed the code, the building code. And think of the building code like computer code. You know, it changes the way the city is built, just like code changes what you can make with it. So it's a profoundly interesting thing to change the code, because that enables a systemic change, whereas making a building very rarely enables a systemic change. Usually you just make the building that's hard enough in itself. As a result of these changes, though, Finland has now started making all kinds of amazing buildings. These were happening to some extent without us, of course. There was a very tricky line trying to track the impact of these policy changes. This is an amazing new library in Helsinki with a huge wooden facade there. There's small-scale wooden buildings like this amazing sauna on the water, and so on and so on. I mean, now tens, if not hundreds, of wooden buildings at scale going up. And of course, that gives another trajectory to the building industry based around the timber industry. So two previously separate sectors, timber, which was oriented in Finland around paper and cardboard and toilet paper, frankly, and was also suffering hugely in terms of competition, suddenly has a new trajectory in terms of a high technology product of building. So usually those two sectors would not be aligned together, but here we managed to use a construction project to change building code in order to shift industrial innovation in two previously disparate sectors now working as a system. And I call this kind of matter and dark matter. So the matter being the building, the dark matter being the code. You can't see the dark matter if you're walking around a city, but that's what makes it happen. You don't really see, if you're holding an iPhone in your hand, all the dark matter that makes that happen, but all of the agreements that Apple has with industry suppliers or record and TV companies to make Apple TV work, or all of the third-party agreements with app providers or the regulatory framework they have to live within. Obviously, that's all dark matter. You don't see it. You just see the phone working. So this interplay between those two is really important. And to be clear, it's really hard to shift dark matter sometimes unless you start working with the matter. As in, unless you try to make a building, you don't realize the building code will stop you trying to make that particular building. How would you know? So making the buildings important, it also gives you an impetus to shift dark matter, as in putting 70 million euros on the table to make a building is kind of a big enough deal to make the building code of Finland lawyers rewrite those lines of code, right? So there's an interplay between these kind of projects. Other examples like this, Brickstarter, which was a civic crowdfunding platform, a prototype that we built, enabling people to propose ideas for cities and build kind of small crowdfunding behind it. This was really a smoke and mirrors prototype, but we wrote a book about it, and that led to some work I did when I was at the Future Cities Catapult for the GLA on an open ideas platform, which then led to Crowdfund London. Again, a wobbly line between those things. I wouldn't say I did Crowdfund London, to be really clear. I definitely advised on it, consulted on it. But and to some extent, it was definitely inspired by Brickstarter. I know because we talked about it. But again, other people made it happen, and that's really important. This kind of design work can only get you so far sometimes, and you need other people to lift those ideas, and they're far more important ultimately because they're the ones who actually deliver and execute it. But without doing the prototypes, there's every chance that Crowdfund London, which became the world's biggest crowdfunding platform for cities at least, wouldn't have emerged. Another project, this one is looking at food culture in Helsinki, and this project Ravintolapäivä, which was basically looking at how, well, let me just take a step back. What's happening in this funny movie is that someone is selling an egg and bacon muffin from their top floor window and selling it to the street. Now, why is she doing this? Because in Finland in 2012, street food was largely illegal because the street was managed by the planning department that thought the street was about traffic and parking. People tried to make street food happen and tried to get permits through the city, but couldn't do that because, again, it was sort of managed in the wrong way. The department just didn't know. The computer said no, if you like. And it was incredibly hard to set up a small cafe. But of course, people in Helsinki knew that this culture existed. They knew because of the internet, things like this happen in Berlin or Camden or whatever. So what happened was that about 40 of them said, let's all get together on Saturday, a random Saturday in 2012, and we will all sell food from our flats simultaneously to the street. None of them had a permit for this. It was basically illegal in a sense, or at least in a gray area. But it was a huge success right away. So you put €5 in the basket, you get an egg and bacon muffin back. Again, she doesn't really have a permit to do that at all, but it was suddenly happening all over the city at scale. This is an Argentinian woman living in the street next door to me, selling empanadas, the Argentinian street food. That's a woman dressed as an empanada in the foreground, advertising this thing, which is the kind of thing citizens will do when they want to make things happen. They'll dress as an empanada all day. This is a Thai soup kitchen in the park. Again, all of this stuff completely illegal, or at least without a permit, put it that way. So you could, I suppose, classify it as illegal, but clearly it's so good. How could this be a bad thing? And of course, it's not a bad thing. It was immensely successful right away. It started spreading all over the city. These women selling quiches, these are hardened criminals. Of course, they're not really. They were using Facebook, which is, as you know, like a weapons grade level tool for organizing, far better than anything the city council had to work with. They built 4 mobile apps across 4 different mobile platforms, iOS, Android, I guess BlackBerry, and whatever Microsoft had at the time. In a weekend-long hackathon. So again, imagine from a public procurement point of view, how long that would take to get up. It probably takes 6 months to get the EOI out of the door. This was done in a weekend. And you see all of those little black shapes are where street food ventures were available, again, illegally, in streets or in parks. They started taking over some of these old beautiful kiosks, which have been lying dormant for some years now. The issue is, of course, this is pop-up tactical urbanism, and that means that the day after Ravintolapaiva, or Restaurant Day, I can hear someone. Can you mute yourself? The day after Ravintolapaiva, or Restaurant Day, then the kiosk was still shut down because nobody had really taken it on. It was just open for one day. And the issue that it was only open for one day was because it was the leasing required you to take out 2 years worth of leasing. And you can't do that if you have half an idea that you might be interested in running a food business. You need a way to prototype or start something up. You can maybe promise 2 weeks rent. You can't promise 2 years. So maybe someone might think I could sell sushi in there, but how do they know? They need to kind of try it. So Ravintolapaiva, which means restaurant day in Finnish, meant that you could try this out. And so we were fascinated by this. We originally thought we were going to have to start a street food thing ourselves. And then we realized, of course, this network was doing it. So we spoke with them and we researched them and spent a lot of time hanging out with them and understanding their concerns. And then we figured out what we need to do is, again, change the dark matter around food culture, not the matter, that was going well, but the dark matter. So we worked with the city of Helsinki to create a food culture incubator called Open Kitchen. And we worked with the top chefs in the city to take people that were interested in starting something up that we knew from Ravintolapaiva, Restaurant Day. We got them to apply with the process about what they'd like to do. It was really successful. We actually had applications from all over the world because by this point, Restaurant Day had spread to 40 countries, which was kind of embarrassing for the city of Helsinki because it was still formally illegal, even though the city's marketing department now wanted to claim it as a kind of Helsinki success story. The deputy mayor of Helsinki, by the way, really didn't know quite how to handle this. So we spoke with him a little bit and he sort of figured out that he could probably just go onto the Facebook page and say, hope you have a nice day, be careful, which was like just making the liability clear was not with the city, whilst also letting people get on with it. So it was kind of interesting and I think smart tactic from him. Anyway, he was quite fretting as to, what if someone does get sick? Of course, no one did get sick because people know how to cook food, actually. Everybody does it every day. But anyway, back to Open Kitchen, it became then a fairly successful kind of MasterChef-like venture. But despite what this picture shows you, it wasn't really about teaching you how to cook. It was more about how do you set up a kitchen? How do you set up a cafe? How do you hire staff? How do you write a menu? How do you fill in the forms? How do you get past the paperwork? All of that stuff which stops things happening dead in their tracks. We worked with this top chef, Anto Melesnian. He was fantastic. We wrote a book about Finnish food culture, about understanding where it came from and what had happened there. We worked with the city of Helsinki's food culture project manager, Ville Relander, who was brilliant here, so he could meet these people, understand what they were trying to do, and then again, take that back into the dark matter of policy and regulations. So again, this kind of influencing thing, this is kind of what happened on the right-hand side, and the city became actually a real leader in terms of street food. You see this kind of, I try to track some of the impact of it, but just again, look at that wobbly line in the middle. Most of the work was done by the activists at the top. Some of it was done by the city of Helsinki in the middle. Some of it was done by us as Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. But also there's this incredibly difficult wobbly line. Then things happened and it started opening up until it came to the point where the Helsinki made its own Streets of Food book and campaign. And there's the deputy mayor who didn't really know what to do, but now claiming it as a Helsinki success story. And you see the city crest of Helsinki on the left there, but with a hot dog replacing the boat. So it's a great story, and it largely again done by other people. But as a designer, there we were working right in the middle of that. I sometimes think it's like playing central midfield in a football team or something. The game is swirling around you, and you have to figure out how to work in the gaps here. So you're doing all of this stuff, left, right, and center. So let me now move to Sweden and the work then in the national government as a director of strategic design there. So what we were doing there was looking at mission-oriented innovation quite a lot. Again, I worked with Mariana Mazzucato on this stuff at UCL for some years now, helping with the theory behind that and some of the practice as well. But we needed to put it into practice in Sweden, and we knew that missions shouldn't really be about target setting. We already have a load of targets. You just think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals alone, and I'm sure all 157 of them, whatever they are. They have things like eradicate poverty in there by 2030. We're supposed to be delivering on these, and we're not doing it very well at all. I'm not really sure throwing new targets on top of that is the best idea. It might be better just to think about how we get behind a lot of these and start aligning them. So we were also very clear that a traditional approach to innovation wouldn't help here, as in technology, as I pointed out earlier with Uber and Lyft, has all kinds of issues. And science and technology-driven innovation has been known since the 1970s when Richard Nelson wrote this book, The Moon and the Ghetto, as okay for some things like the Apollo mission, but not great for social problems. And social problems are far harder than getting to the moon, to be clear. The moon is a technical accomplishment and an amazing one, but it didn't ask Americans to significantly change their lifestyles or anything. I mean, in fact, if anything, it reinforced a pattern of living in America, even though it employed something like 20% of the American economy at certain points. It didn't really give America any tools to, in the language of the 70s, address the ghetto, right? It hasn't made any progress on that, arguably. So it's really problematic to try and see science and technology as the answer to things like the climate crisis or social justice questions that are public health questions now, because we know that they are social and cultural and political as much as they're technical, if not more. Now, in Sweden, there are examples of balancing innovation with social and cultural and technical questions. It has a decent history of that in many respects. The Million Program, as it was known from 1965 to 1974, was a mission almost before the word was invented by Mariana and others, building 1 million new dwellings at an affordable point over 10 years. It was really incredible. Actually, New Zealand tried to make 100,000 in 10 years, 2 years ago, and gave up and said it's impossible. Somehow Sweden, which is roughly the same size as New Zealand as it was in 1965, managed to do that completely. So somehow we've gone backwards on our capabilities here. The seatbelt emerged from a public-private partnership between Volvo and Vattenfall, the state energy company. So there's examples of this innovation solving social challenges for technical, public, and private sector working together. This is really what the mission there is about. You have a grand challenge, let's say climate adaptation, and then there's a set of missions within that, and they align a set of sectors, like on the left-hand side here, and you have a whole bunch of projects. I mean, it's very common sense, and it's also incredibly smart and clear. What we need to do, though, is figure out how to turn that again to practice on the ground. So what I did was sort of say, flip this round or through 90 degrees, as if sort of putting it over time on a horizontal axis, as opposed to the structural diagram on the right, which is kind of vertical, like an org chart. The one on the right-hand side is more like a timeline. So you start with framing the challenge collectively with your actors in the system or the theme, and then leads to the projects. Like this, you go from angles to missions to prototypes to then large-scale system demonstrators. We picked a couple of areas, which I can get to in the Q&A as to why we picked these if you like, but mobility and food. And with mobility, we started, and food, we both got out onto the road very quickly indeed and did workshop after workshop. We got through about 500 different organizations in about 6 months, doing these big open processes, public, private, third sector, all in the room at the same time, big and small players within these systems, all collectively working on huge pieces of paper. We did walking tours, got people out of their offices to understand the context of everyday life around food systems and mobility. These very messy systems canvases emerged from that process. You want them to be messy at this point, actually, because it's got everything on the table here. Questions and answers and technologies and social stuff and challenges and possibilities. Within that, we then took those system diagrams apart and framed them around supply side and demand side measures. Within that, we're looking at, where possible, upstream solutions. So by upstream, we mean things like addressing health, but preventative. So you see on the left-hand side, all of those graphs going up forever, same as the UK. Sweden's healthcare costs just go up to the top right corner forever, as far as we can tell. It's an aging population, despite technical advances. And yet, if you look on the right-hand side, only 3% of the healthcare budget's devoted to preventative care. That's fairly typical for so-called advanced nations. Whereas 80% of the healthcare costs are in chronic diseases, and 80% of those chronic diseases can be attributed to lifestyle and living conditions, largely. So they are to do with the way we move around, or the way we live, or what we live in, or how we live together. Key point here of difference, obviously, with the UK, the power structure is upside down. So in Sweden, you pay your income tax to the municipality, for instance. And so they have a lot of power. They do housing and planning and so on. The regional government does healthcare and public transport. The national government does foreign policy and a few things around immigration, of course. And to some extent, it's important in terms of agenda setting and sort of public perception and awareness of things. But actually, the power is very much local, whereas the UK, as you all know, is completely the other way around, one of the most centralized countries in the OECD. So there's not as much at this sort of city and county level in terms of power and tax take and legitimacy to some extent, or everyday touch points. So we knew that we needed to work locally on all of these things in Sweden. So these missions framed around these particular clusters of challenges. And out of those came some things a bit like the moonshot, as in a technical challenge, like we just need to turn all these heavy trucks from diesel to electric. That's something we need to do. We also need to reduce the number of heavy trucks that we, in Sweden anyway, happen to have Volvo and Scania, which is like 40% of the trucks in the world. So might as well electrify them. So that's something we can just crack on with. The more interesting one, perhaps, is this one around streets, looking at the mobility system more openly again, looking at the street as a kind of a starting point or an end point for mobility systems. Within that, then, we did lots of further workshops, zooming down to street level. And here we've got what we call these system in the room workshops. Again, you have a startup in there, you've got a large tech company, you've got a rather bored-looking municipal planner. He was a very nice guy. Matthias, thank you so much. We all work on the project. But they're working together again, sketching things out collectively, because we know that every one of them has a little piece of the puzzle. Nobody runs everything when you're talking about things like streets, which are complex systems. We also reframed the way that people were thinking about stuff. So, we might look at something like a bit of Stockholm that they all knew, very beautiful kind of garden city layout from 1905. But we also knew that in these exactly 20 years after these were designed, or 30 years, these things came along, and this is a short newsreel that was running in Swedish cinemas in the 1930s. Exactly the same thing was running in the UK at the time. And this is the streets as they used to be. And they give us a glimpse of the way that street systems used to be for about 600 to 700 years before 1935 in somewhere like Stockholm. As in, streets were full of culture and life and conviviality and fluidity and movement and diversity. This guy is my hero, by the way. In the film, he's called Old Mr. Stockholm. He's single-handedly holding back the traffic. But you saw just previously, kids playing in the street. Of course, that happened again for about 600 years before cars came along. Now, in Swedish, down the bottom there, this is called de som går i vägen, which means those who get in the way. And it's basically a propaganda film saying to people, okay, the streets are now about cars. You need to stop all of this walking business or cycling or having a chat in the middle of the street or reading the newspaper. It's just for cars now. So this is actually relatively recent. This is when my grandparents were alive. My dad was born about 3 years after this. So it's within living memory how rapid this change has been, which is kind of interesting. We also showed, of course, other places, in Tokyo, the world's biggest city, about 30 million people, 35 million people living in a mega region. The streets are highly convivial and open and fluid like this, numerous kinds of things there. And that's because there's no on-street parking in Japan. And there hasn't been since 1965. So you have this interplay between the culture, what happens on the street, and the way that it happens, which is complex, but something you can also engage with as a designer or as a policymaker, and the regulation, which is absolutely something you can engage with as a policymaker or a designer. And the interplay between those two makes something happen or shift. We also looked at using imaginative processes like shared narratives. We got people to finish these kind of speculative narratives set in the near future, which was again unlocking the thinking about how this happened. That's really important because everybody knows what a busy street looks like now, or a 4-lane highway, as this quote points out. But no one really knows what, let's say, for instance, a restored landscape looks like. We also showed things like, film like Black Panther, which for me is a great film about public transport. I mean, that's not what Black Panther's about, but it happens to have this glimpses of the city scenes in this, designed by Hannah Beekler, amazing production designer. There are no cars in Wakanda at all, so it's a very beautiful vision of a highly convivial place. This is instantly recognizably on the African continent, and you see technologies in there, but you also see street patterns that would have existed for centuries at the same time as Hyperloop and floating autonomous shuttles. So it's kind of fascinating. And this makes you rethink also then what technology is as well. So this little story is about the Omni processor in Dakar, which cleans dirty water, takes water in and turns it into drinking water. An amazing thing funded by the Gates Foundation. An enormous machine. I mean, it's clearly a technology. But Julia Watson's book, Low Tech, about indigenous practices, also points out there are other technologies. So the East Kolkata wetlands, which you're seeing pictures of here, is also a technology. It's completely shaped by humans. It's made of natural materials and processes, but it's shaped by humans with a series of stepped pools. And it also cleans water. And you look at how these two technologies stack up. The one on the left, 14 tons of sewage a day and makes thousands of liters of drinking water. That's a good thing. The East Kolkata wetlands takes in 700 million tons of sewage a day and cleans it. And it also generates 13,000 tons of fish, 16,000 tons of rice, and so on and so on. 80,000 jobs, protects the city from storms, soaks up water, increases flood protection, saves on logistics, all of these things. But it's the one on the right that is threatened by property development, whereas the one on the left gets millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation. And we need to rethink our understanding of tech here completely. So we're also doing this in this kind of work too. In Australia, where I am now, there's a deep understanding of these, particularly with indigenous knowledge systems. So this story is about Budj Bim, which after the bushfires in 2019 was revealed to be, well, it was known to be, but it was actually opened up as a series of eel farms that had been made at least 6,000, if not 8,000 years ago. So a long, long time ago. And when it started raining after the fires, they just started working again, catching precisely the right amount of eels, so as not to diminish stocks, but also to catch the eels. And so this is like a 6,000-year-old operating system that just rebooted instantaneously. I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk come up with anything this good, then we should pay attention to them. But sadly, again, this is not really recognized in this sense. The value of these indigenous knowledge systems is only recently becoming clear in Australia. We're doing a lot of work around that, as are many others in Australia. Some of you know we have a referendum on Saturday, and I hope we vote yes in that to create another chamber in the Australian government, an advisory board, really. Nonetheless, it's clear that these are not really respected as technologies, and they need to be. Because Ursula K. Le Guin's point is technology is the active human interface with the material world, a far more open and imaginative understanding of that. And imagination is key here, right? Because we are suffering from an imagination deficit. I can't help but bring up in this context the government's ridiculous aligning with the conspiracy theorists around 15-minute cities, which is embarrassing if it wasn't so dangerous. And it really shows this, again, lack of imagination in the best sense, if you like, as in, let's assume it's not entirely malicious and it's just a failure of imagination. And Rebecca Solnit says that's really problematic right now. So we need to come back to this. Do we have enough of an understanding of imagination in our culture here? Is it thoroughly integrated or not? When we're thinking about streets, they are indeed cultural and technical at the same time. Again, Solnit puts it very nicely. It's about errands, as in coffee needs milk to be delivered at 6 a.m., but it's about epiphanies as well, as in you meet someone, you might fall in love with them or start a band or start a business. Those streets do that as well. So this is about designing a different kind of disposition around these things. That's an urban design term, really. But how do we enable a participation and a shared care for these systems of everyday life? Artists have a lot to contribute here in terms of understanding this, helping us understand these, and as designers, we can work with these systems to produce different outcomes. This is a parking lot turned into a meadow. This is a parking lot turned into a farm in Los Angeles, where Ron Finley's figured out there are 26 Central Parks worth of parking lots that could be turned into farms. It's growing 724 million tomato plants in where there are previously food deserts. I mean, extraordinary work. This is the care blocks in Bogota, an amazing, I think one of the most inspiring projects we're on at the moment, where women are paid for the unpaid labor that they do at home to take care of childcare and laundry and all of the other unpaid labor, so that their time is freed up and they can go to the care block and get retrained in whatever they want to do, whether it's riding a bike or learning how to write code. So social justice, education, infrastructure, all being centered around these kind of 15-minute city ideas as well. This very simple project in Berlin, which isn't a project at all. It's just citizens taking care of the street when the city stopped taking care of the street because the city ran out of money. So in this case, the municipality stepped back in quite a nice way, actually, and just sort of turned a blind eye to it. Sort of illegal, this, actually, or there wasn't a bylaw for it, but they just enabled it to happen. So this is looking at different scales of city and different types of decision-making culture up and down those scales. Participation at the street level on the left-hand side can be done by citizens themselves, I would argue. This is what I call the 1-minute city scale. Something like a wetlands or a stadium or a cathedral or a regional electricity grid is at the 60-minute city scale. It's an enormous system and takes a representative decision-making culture. Then these interplay with each other in interesting ways, as in the more microgrids you have at the 1-minute city scale, the fewer regional grids you need at the 60-minute city scale. You can turn off coal-fired power stations pretty rapidly, as we've seen. All of these are about different ways of respecting the way that actually citizens can be part of this process. And then these are quotes to that effect. I won't go into them now because I know I'm running out of time. So let me just finish off with this street project again and get to the end of this part. So what we were doing there is really reframing the way streets are thought of. Instead of the street being seen, like on the left-hand side here, as the province of the traffic department, as in you give the street to the traffic department, you get traffic, the clue is in the name. I mean, indeed, if you gave the street to gardeners, you'd get gardens, right? On the right-hand side, we want to introduce as many different stakeholders as we can around the street, knowing that it is a diverse, complex system again, so that we can produce multiple outputs. The street can reduce pollution, increase social fabric, increase culture, reduce crime, reduce stormwater flooding. All of these things can happen there, right? Only if they're part of the process, though. So we call this reframing. So like in the middle column here, if the street was approached as if it's a problem of creating health, social fabric, and biodiversity, then you would do different things with it, right? If it's this problem of just getting 1,000 cars per hour down it without killing anybody, then you do something else again. But as our largest public space in cities and towns, the street is far more important than just getting 1,000 cars per hour down it. It's the biggest space that we have to work with. So this is a reframing, and I call this kind of a soft eyes approach, actually, seeing the existing thing in a different way. I'll play this clip. So I hope you could hear the audio there because the voices are pretty compelling. But that is really trying to see that the street can be both a super detailed system on the ground, a very particular place, but also the biggest thing in the city, and in fact, the biggest thing in the nation. What we figured out that in Sweden, there were 40,000 kilometers of street like this, which we could unlock as one single system. So soft eyes enables you to zoom backwards and forwards between those two different scales, to see a tree in the street and then zoom back and see the reforesting the city via streets, and zoom back further again to see the same thing at a national scale. Hard eyes is a very technical approach to it. Soft eyes enables you to see multiple systems at once. So these are the kind of drawings that came out of those workshops. This is really putting supply and demand on the table at the same time, as we need to do with energy, that Saul Griffith points out. We can see this when we don't tend to do this enough. You know, the UK housing strategy at the moment to build something like 300,000 homes a year, well, it was anyway, would blow the country's entire carbon budget just on those houses. My colleagues at UCL have figured out. There are other ways of seeing this more positively. This was released yesterday. UCL said, you know, if you build social and affordable housing, you save 1.5 billion a year. It doesn't cost it, you save it. So that's an extraordinary thing, but only if you see systems in that way. So we did see these systems. These are system diagrams we did around the street, but really they're not worth mapping or engineering as abstract things. Actually, they need to be experienced. So that's when we get into the participative stuff. So this is doing the same kind of workshop now at the highest level. That's the Swedish Prime Minister on the left-hand side and the Health Minister to his left or your right. And we're doing the same kind of workshop that we were doing with the public and private sector players previously. And this is now flipping the system in the room into the room in the system. So it's putting innovation actually into the system itself, in the street. So we found a series of streets in Stockholm with schools on them that the municipality kindly let us prototype with. And that meant that we could give the pen to school kids. So these school kids are the actual experts in their streets, not the traffic planner in town hall 5 kilometers away. These kids go there every day. So they know actually what the street needs in far more detail than anybody else, them and the residents that live there, who are also part of this process. So they are the designers here. They're the ones coming up with it. They're much better than prime ministers at this kind of thing, as you can imagine. Prime ministers have other qualities. But these kids were very both sensible and creative, imaginative and playful, but also making seats for older people to sit down and so on, trees as well as fake palm trees. We turned that into a system that could be scaled, working with an industrial design company and ArcDes, the Swedish Center for Architecture and Design. This is a kind of a platform model, and then installed that across 3 cities in the first instance, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Helsingborg, and then a whole bunch beyond that now. And these are those in situ. We used Swedish timber for numerous reasons. Partly it's a circular material, partly it's beautiful, partly it changes the dynamic, the aesthetic of the street. Again, it reframes what people think, but it also means that you have to go back and check it in 2 years' time, and the street changes, right? We didn't have e-scooters 5 years ago, and now we do. So that has a kind of a clock speed running on these things, which enables us to turn maintenance into care, turn a negative or a cost into a positive, an asset. Here we're looking at we worked with the artist and musician Brian Eno to write some design principles, and there's a couple there that are worth looking at. The one in the bottom left is the one I just talked about. Wood is something we can change and adapt. Steel and concrete aren't. So making a virtue of being able to change is really important. And then think like a gardener, not an architect. Design beginnings, not endings. If you think about it with policy, often it's about designing the ending, but actually we should be designing the beginning on these things and rolling them forward. So I call this kind of start by starting, taking an existing street and getting going in it as soon as possible, taking a half step forward, knowing that that's not the answer to anything. It's just a possibility, but make it real. Work with citizens on that. Maybe there's another step after that and another step and so on and so on. And then you've got the ball moving up the pitch, right? You've got something going. It's very tricky to plan this using traditional tools, but then anything innovative usually isn't. I was kind of mean about the moon landing earlier. So in their credit, I would just say, if you look at their budget profile, this is the NASA spending. It was way off whack for the first, 10, 15 years or so while they were getting the moon landing done. But as soon as they've been to the moon a few times, it stabilized and normalized, in fact. And that's the way that innovation works. I'd argue probably the way that any meaningful policy works. It's hard to predict in advance what the budget profile is, no matter how much our processes try to get us to do that. To NASA's credit, they held their nerve on that. So these are never finished, always continuous processes. This is very important, another way in terms of the theory of change here, not just by getting something going, but because it enables us to start working with people and flushing the system out in reality. We know that the answer should be things like probably less driving, right? But it's very hard to just email everybody in Sweden and they'll go, oh, okay, I'll sell my car then. You have to actually give people a chance to try something out in an open-ended way. These quotes say that kind of thing, essentially. They're saying it's much easier to do technical challenges. It's much harder to run a social care program in a small town or design social policies around education, say, than it is technical challenges. So they require a different approach. They're beyond traditional analysis. And particularly when we've cultivated things like car dependency and you have something like motor normativity in the UK now. So there's a big shift here, and this is from the UK Government Office for Science. moving away from predict and provide towards something called decide and provide, actually, and then making that happen. And then making that happen is done on the street in reality. Now, this is important with partners. When we work with the street stuff in Sweden, we work with Volvo Cars as one of the partners there. It's kind of easy to do that to some extent in Sweden. But you see here the quote from the CEO saying, the private car is not a very practical concept anymore in cities, really. We intend to limit the number of cars in the city. That's what the car companies are saying. Somebody should tell the Transport Secretary of the UK this, by the way. This is what the car companies are saying. So what's holding us back? We have to work with them to show how you can make this happen. For instance, with car sharing, which is this is their animation on the right, using the design that we came up with in the mission, showing that for every share car you put in, you can replace up to 7 or 8 cars in a street like that. So how do we move from predict and provide to decide and provide? How do we recognize that social license is cultivated, not innate? How do we understand social innovation within these processes? And this is a platform now for asking questions in public, and it asks us to who decides these things. These people have never been given the chance to decide their street before, right? And now they had the chance, and suddenly we found that they were up for removing car parking. It was 74% positive about that, in fact, with a 400% increase in activity on the street. Again, taking car parking away. Given the choice, people did that. Underneath this is a complex value model where we started looking at all of the different value that this might produce, not just through the lens of traffic planning, but in terms of health, biodiversity, maintenance, commerce, property, all kinds of things here. That's a very different kind of evaluation process as well. And then finally, we started looking at the platform strategy underneath that and stacking up. And where I started with the Tokyo example, you can make a street happen at the top level. That also requires you to look at that dark matter of policy, financing, law, as well underneath to enable it to spread. So again, the culture is the top one, the regulation is the bottom one. We had players, if you look on the right-hand side there, from all of those different levels as part of this mission. In a sense, then, they were beginning to almost cosplay or role play a different type of organization here, just by working together and working in the shape of the system itself. The idea of almost a street agency started emerging in people's minds. And that makes you think about designing the team in a different way for these kinds of things, which is super important to thinking through the project, not just assuming that the existing key teams can deliver completely different policies. Okay, I think I'm going to actually pause. So we have at least some time questions, because you could see I could go on, and I'm not going to do that. I just wanted to just end by saying that, you know, some of this is in the context of what you might call a return of public purpose. Underneath that is this core idea about where public designers can really play out. I like this quote from Tony Judd, the brilliant writer 20 years ago. Don't privatize railways, don't nationalize sandwiches, which has stuck in my head ever since and helps us think about how to organize these systems. So then to find, you know, just to finish, just to say that street stuff ended up being known as the 1 minute city and spreading worldwide. It was in the New York Times like a couple of weeks ago. It's now 25 municipalities across Sweden, Normandy, California. And I can tell you it was the project with probably the smallest budget in Vinnova's history. So I'll stop. I could go on. But thank you for sticking with me.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. There have been some couple of questions just around sharing the slides. Do you want to confirm?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, they can be sent out to everyone attending today. Knowing that people, I would like to leave some room for questions, but equally knowing that some people probably have other calls to jump onto. I don't know what your kind of time.
I can stick around all night. I'm just
I think at some point we need to let Dan go to bed. But should we do 1 or 2 questions? Someone who
yeah, I can stay as long as you like, but yeah, because I did go on a bit. I'm aware of that. So anybody want to ask a question?
Yes.
Tim.
Hey Dan, hopefully you can hear me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I reread Dark Matter and Trojan Horses a few months ago, and it was brimming with 2012 energy. It was like a really nice, refreshing read. And I wondered if the position you take in that book, has it changed over the last kind of 10 years? Given everything.
It's a very nice way of saying it's very dated.
No.
No, I mean, I definitely started it with the Arab Spring. I remember that. So definitely my thinking around that has changed. Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think there are some things where I was definitely writing from the context of working inside Citra at the time, all that Finnish stuff I started the talk with. And then having worked at Arup previously, a consultancy, and, you know, getting a bit worried about the impact that consultancies could have, as in that they couldn't have really because they weren't internal. And so I was very much looking at the bringing design inside the organization as the goal. I still think that, but maybe I would be more, I'm more open to the idea of well-meaning private sector companies being part of that as well. As you know, I also went back and worked at Arup after Citra and then the Future Cities Catapult, and mainly most of it was public sector. We also know that many consultants are deeply problematic, not least in Australia and the UK. So that bit hasn't changed, but I think, no, I think a lot of the examples I think probably hold up. I think the Swedish stuff that I just wrote another book about last year is probably like a sort of a 10 years on kind of bookend. It has another bunch of examples, and they two sort of fit together as two, yeah, sort of nice little Nordic bookshelves, I suppose.
Nice, thank you.
Karen.
Okay, with 2 minutes left. Karen, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Dan. That was fascinating to hear all those different stories. One really common theme that came through is how you took policymakers, decision makers, traffic planners and senior government people on a fairly radical journey for them. And I suppose as a person who's spent my life with risk-averse public servants, how did you tell us the story of some of that, taking them on the journey?
Oh my God, have you got another hour? No, I think, again, actually, that is in this book that I just wrote. There's definitely techniques and tips for that in there. It's called Designing Missions. I'll put it in the chat, actually. It's free download from the Vinnova website, courtesy of the Swedish taxpayer. So go for it. But there's a lot of things going on there. The reframing, though, is really key. If there's one word I'd come back to there, I'd just say that we did that in numerous ways. We did that by thinking carefully even about the location of workshops, getting people out of their office. We did one of those workshops in the Swedish Museum of Alcohol. No alcohol was taken, but you know, it just happened to be a beautiful museum down on the waterfront, and it had a history of food, sort of future food exhibition going on there in the building. So, and we took the participants through that before the workshop, and then we had a lunch afterwards with food that was all grown from local providers, as in within like 10 meters of the restaurant in some cases, and certainly within 100 meters. So all of those subtle things basically get people to sort of metaphorically loosen their tie, if you like, and they start relaxing a bit and being more human rather than a bureaucrat first, human second. It's human first, and then still representing their organization. We did all of those walks. We would make sure that every workshop was a diverse set of participants, trying to make things as tangible as possible. We built prototypes and made sure that everybody came to those things. So one last thing I'll say here, because again, this is all in the book, that we were working with somebody from the National Transport Agency that writes the transport regulation. I guess the Ministry for Transport equivalent in the UK writes the law around it, though, so writes the parking space law for the whole country. And they're based in the middle of Sweden, if you like. They're sort of almost like a kind of, I don't know, Leicester type place, but in Sweden. And we were in Stockholm. And when we launched the project, we invited her to the project launch because she'd been great, a fantastic contributor. And she said, this is the first time I've actually been to a project on the ground. I've been to the place where a project happened in 20 years of working in the National Transport Agency, right? So she'd been doing all of that work using Word docs and spreadsheets and PowerPoint from an office in the middle of Sweden, and had never really kind of been down to the street, even though she writes the parking space law. She'd been to the street as a person, but not as an official. So it was just fascinating to me that, you can actually go through almost 2 decades of regulatory work and not engage with the reality of the system on the ground. So I'd say those kinds of, all of those little things, to some extent they're tips and techniques, but they're profound cultural shifts, and trying to get, again, this kind of soft eyes thinking, responding as a human, talking to somebody from the health agency in the street, next to somebody from a municipality, 3 levels of government standing next to each other, and recognizing that they're all implicated in that patch of concrete in front of them, Or you could point to a street tree and say that street tree is a health worker, really, but it sits on the city council's municipal budget as a cost. How come the regional health department can't invest in that because it's basically making people healthy? That's much easier to have that conversation where you're actually standing there leaning on the tree. It's very easy for people to abstract away into email and systems otherwise. So there's lots of, there's lots of things going on there. Thank you for putting that book in the chat, whoever did that. You can download that PDF from there. I think there's just a couple of other questions. I'll dig in here. You're totally right. Who is it? Geert? I can't remember who said it about Gail Westad. Sorry, about not the norm for most car companies. About the Volvo CEO. I think that is definitely true. And Volvo were, obviously that's a Swedish person, but talking in a Swedish car company, albeit owned by a Chinese company now. So they're not as Swedish as you might think in a sense, but they're still based in Gothenburg in terms of their design and so on. And he was talking in the context of their car sharing business. So still a business for Volvo, but just based around car sharing, not just pure car manufacture. That shift is happening, I think, bit by bit. And it's a really profound one because, again, it goes back to that Cedric Price quote I started with, I suppose, which is like, how do we move around? And there is lots of business in the industry to do within that question. Let's just not use the 20th century version of that, which is the private car. That is the most 20th century object out there in many ways, and it doesn't map onto the cities that we have now at all. We know this is the challenge we're dealing with. So that reframing was fantastically useful that the Volvo CEO said that. I didn't say that, clearly everybody knows where I'm coming from. But when a car company CEO says that, I can use that as a tool in a workshop, it just opens up the conversation again. And then somebody, of course, says exactly what you said, Gail, but would Toyota say that? Maybe, maybe not yet. But there's one direction of travel here, really, in the end, has to be fewer cars. So it's just a question of when and how. We're currently still in the stage where the cars are kind of in saturation point, but in the end, we have to get to fewer if we hit any of the targets that we've all signed up to as nations and cities. So the sooner we start putting that on the table and thinking out, well, okay, how can we start trialing alternatives? What does that mean? Is it car sharing? Is it better public transport? Is it e-bikes? Is it cargo bikes? Is it better planning so I can walk to the kindergarten? It's all of those things, of course, far more diverse. But until people get a chance to explore that, then again, it's a bit like the quote about the 4-lane freeway. Everybody knows what it looks like, so everybody just keeps making it. Anyway, sorry, that's my car talk. I mean, it'd be good to talk about LTNs in London about this stuff as well, because it's the way, I suppose, that we tried to do it was, as you could see, using school kids. I mean, I don't mean using as a verb. I mean, in like literally as the traffic planners. Like that was elevating the user in this case and flattening the hierarchies around it, saying that something like a street is not just a technical challenge. As soon as you say we're going to have school kids and Brian Eno deciding, then clearly it's not just a technical challenge at that point. It doesn't mean that there aren't technical questions in there, and of course we had architects kind of making that work as well, but the ideas were coming from the kids, and that was a much better way of getting the conversation going. It's just harder to stare down a 6-year-old, frankly. It's harder to say, yeah, I'm happy with 6-year-olds breathing polluted air and being run over by cars. Nobody wants that. Absolutely nobody. So you can, that's not being kind of Machiavellian. It's literally saying these people are the users of the street. If the street next door had 80-year-olds on it, we did the same exercise with 80-year-olds. they would probably end up with pretty much the same answers as the 8-year-olds, actually, 6-year-olds, but still.
Yeah,
Any
I
other
think I have a lot to say about healthy like LTNs and stuff, but perhaps not today.
That is another hour as well.
With that said, I need to attend a climate action working group.
Good for you. Go for it.
Yeah. So, is there any ways can people contact you in any ways if they have questions? Or
yeah, no, of course. I'm on the internet.
Yeah.
So you can find me at cityofsound@gmail.com, which is my Gmail address. I'll just put that in the chat, which I can't promise I will respond quickly, but I will respond. My university email just gets clogged with academic misconduct hearings and things like that. You don't want to be in that inbox. Yeah, and I'll maybe Katerina, if I make a PDF of the slides and you can send it around. And I'm always happy to come and do another talk because believe it or not, I only got halfway through.
Well, stay tuned for a part 2, perhaps with more room for questions.
Whenever you like,
well.
yeah. I didn't even get to Australia. I'm still stuck in the Nordics, so there's more to come.
which for me as a half Swedish, half Finnish person was quite exciting to hear about. Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. I know you've already done a round of kind of virtual applause, but yeah, thank you so much, and I'll definitely pick up on kind of doing a second session. Like great response today, and very huge interest. So thank you again. I put some links in there for future events already scheduled. Also, please connect via email or on LinkedIn. Always appreciated. And if you have any ideas for future sessions, just let me know. And thank you everyone for listening, attending, and asking very good questions. And I hope to see you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.